Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. I had been driving my truck through eastern Arkansas's 4 hours, determined to make good time and get as close to Tennessee as possible before finding a place to park and rest for the night. As I continued down the road, I made a terrible dad joke to myself. Why was 6 afraid of? It was one of those dreary days that weren't quite rainy, but the air had a heavy dampness that lingered, making everything feel damp and cold. I saw that the sun was setting as I passed by many diners and truck stops along the way, but something inside of me kept pushing me to keep going. It wasn't until I was too exhausted to drive safely that I finally made the decision to pull into a small, isolated rest stop off the interstate 789, laughing at my own joke about stretching my legs and taking a much-needed break to use the restroom. I climbed back into my cab with a cup of warm coffee from the vending machine. This rest stop seemed completely normal. There were a few other trucks parked in the lot, but there weren't many people around. That's when things took an unsettling turn, and as I reached for the keys in my pocket, I noticed movement out. Man, or at least what appeared to be a man, was standing across the parking lot from one of those flickering street lights that you only see in scary movies. His silhouette was big and bulky, and an enormous hood covered his face. He stood motionless, just staring at me from across the lot. Despite my uneasiness, I tried to dismiss it, figuring he might be someone else, when I heard a loud thud against my truck. My heart raced. I looked out my window, expecting to see the hooded figure, but he was still standing in the same spot as before, now accompanied by 2 others who were just like him. The truck driver had stopped to stretch his legs or smoke a cigarette to shake off the strange feeling, so I started my engine and sat down in my seat. They were still standing in a line, their faces obscured by the hoods, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel when one of them ran to a nearby truck, jumped onto its hood, and started tearing it apart, scraping metal against metal in a deafening screech. Panicked, I turned on my headlights and blared the horn, and immediately, pleading with me to give some warning, the figure stopped. When they suddenly turned their heads in the direction of my truck, I briefly saw one of their faces as the hood moved. It was completely unrecognizable, with only bloodshot eyes and orange flesh, as if something had eaten away at his skin with corrosive acid. My mind begged me to act, but fear had taken over, causing me to clench my teeth and tell myself that now was not the time for cowardice. All 3 agents, predictably, leapt out of the way with remarkable agility as I slammed down on the gas pedal, aimed directly at those menacing figures, and let loose a battle cry. However, it was enough to drive them away from their previous pursuit, as windows and mirrors shattered around me as they attacked my truck while I fled, something I never would have imagined. Driving as fast as I could, I managed to put some distance between myself and the rest stop, but my heart was thumping in my chest and my palms were sweating profusely. As I raced down that empty interstate, adrenaline rushing through my veins, I dared not turn around until those dim street lights disappeared from view. Luxury of calling for help, because I kept thinking that doing so would only make me more vulnerable, as if a predator would take advantage of my weakness to survive this bizarre incident. As the hours went by, I carefully examined my rearview mirror and saw no signs of those who'd put assailants, but eventually my fatigue overcame me, and I had to find a place to stay. To relax, I pulled into a modest motel along the road, unloaded my things, and locked myself inside. That night, I was restless and troubled by thoughts of the hooded figures and their gory appearance. I couldn't stop wondering who or what these creatures were. The following day, after my nerves had been greatly heightened, I went into town to get assistance, and a nearby diner seemed like a good place to go. Beginning point to obtain information, or at least run into someone who might know something helpful. Pardon me. I cautiously approached the waitress and asked if there had been any recent strange sightings of hooded individuals or mutilated trucks. She hesitated for a moment before quietly responding, "You're not the first one asking about those things people say. There's some sort of hitman hunting specific targets with now that I knew who these attackers were. Hitman, led by a man named Barnaby Kell." I couldn't get rid of an unshakable feeling. Precision's leader, Barnaby Krell, overheard our conversation and stepped in to listen. He told me emphatically that I didn't want anything to do with them because they had brutally slaughtered several people around our town in recent rec weeks. There was little point in involving local authorities in my predicament given their close-knit allegiances. So I was on my own, heading back to the motel. I was ready to leave quickly, anxious to be one step ahead of these people. The paranoia spread like a toxic cloud, possibly because I discovered information I shouldn't have, or because I had unknowingly become a target for reasons I couldn't understand. In the distance, I saw 3 motorcycles with matte black paint parked close by. My heart raced as I recalled the horrifying pictures of the assailants from the previous night. As night fell, I saw one of the hooded figures outside, but this time he was carrying a bloody sledgehammer, and his face was still hidden inside his hood. An insidious chuckle cracked from under his hood as he reared up to strike again. I quickly returned to my truck before they could see me and made a desperate attempt at annihilation, though it appeared futile, as he swung the sledgehammer towards the nearby car with a force I couldn't imagine was contained in human arms. Metal crumpled and shattered glass flew through the air. Planned my route out of town while my tires screeched beneath me, draining me of all my courage. One thing was certain, though: Kell and his evil men were fed only on terror, and they hadn't finished their terrifying mission. Instead of racing into the horizon like I had done previously, it seemed inevitable that I would face these creatures in mortal combat again. But for the time being, I was driving along a seemingly endless stretch of Route 40 in Arizona, when my truck's engine coughed, giving me an unpleasant jolt. I prayed that luck would stay on my side at least until I could figure out a practical way to get rid of the unsettling threats in pursuit, with a life-defying resolution casting its quiet storm just beyond reach. As the new kid in my small family of truckers, I frequently took the less desirable routes, the ones that took me through lonely stretches of highway where people rarely ventured. But this time, not even the light-hearted banter over the CB radio could save me from the increasingly heavy air of doom. I thought of the drive as just another job, another destination, pushing the nagging feeling of impending doom down and away. It all started when I saw a strange shape on my radar. It wasn't a normal blip from another car or a familiar landmark, but whatever it was, it appeared to be rapidly approaching my car. I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone on the interstate. Then, a slight flicker in my rearview mirror caused my attention, and I looked at my headlights, thinking it might just be I concentrated on keeping a steady pace and watching the quickly approaching lights as another driver passed me. But something didn't feel right. They were calculating and maintained an unnerving constant speed as the car drew closer and closer. I remembered brief exchanges with other experienced drivers about mysterious events along this specific route. Within minutes, I felt completely trapped, unable to get this stranger off my tail or find any assistance on the radio. All that was left was a tense silence interspersed with tense spasms in my taxi. Tales of terror replaced any semblance of light-heartedness as rumors of a vicious murderer started to swirl through my mind, tainting any attempts at humor with dark foreboding. From engine hiccups, my blood turned to ice when those menacing headlights finally hit my truck. This car matched the black sedan of the wanted serial killer, a dark, menacing car without license plates that promised a grisly end. Before I could take any action, The sedan suddenly swung out, joining me in the right lane and slowly drawing my breath alongside me. My survival instinct took over without waiting for more provocation, and I pressed down hard on the gas pedal as I looked at the driver, a man of unknown age and completely unremarkable appearance, wearing a sickening smile that seemed inspired by some sick caricaturist. I felt my truck lurch forward with incredible force. The violent acceleration made me tighten my grip on the steering wheel to keep from colliding with him. The enigmatic man in the sedan didn't even flinch. Instead, his head snapped toward me, and his twisted grin never wavered as he also sped up to keep up with me. My logical mind found it difficult to comprehend what was going on. Was he the cause of my engine trouble, or was he just kismet that had shown up now? And what was his end game? As these thoughts raced through my head like a train on fire, a thought came to me. I realized that there was an exit not too far away. Perhaps if I could get there before him and make an evasive maneuver, I could end this threat once and for all. All semblance of cautious driving vanished as I floored it, watching the miles fly by quickly until the exit sign appeared and my fingers touched it. I took a deep breath and counted down the seconds until my bold plan came to pass. 3 to 1, I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, swerving onto the exit ramp at the last possible second. In the adrenaline-pumping chaos, I clenched the steering wheel in desperation because I knew I had only one chance to outmaneuver this monster that was pursuing me. That followed. I was able to slow my truck down enough to make a U-turn before speeding down a side road in the vain hope that I had escaped my assailant. However, my relief was fleeting as the black sedan followed suit and continued its relentless pursuit. My heart raced and I felt perspiration trickle down my face, knowing that there had to be a reason why this man was pursuing me. Putting my fears aside, I desperately called my older brother on my cell phone in the hopes that he might have some advice or insight for dealing with this terrifying situation. When he answered, I realized that someone was following me, and that he was driving a black sedan without license plates that fits the description of that infamous killer. My brother's voice cracked with concern as he asked for details about our present location and whether there were any secure areas close by where I could hide, while he called the local authorities for assistance. With a glimmer of hope, I looked around and noticed an old diner just off the next exit. Maybe there would be helpful people or even assistance within its secure boundaries. "I'll go to that diner right away. Please hurry," I frantically yelled, before hanging up the phone and making my move, swerving once more into the parking lot of the rundown diner. I was relieved to see that customers were enjoying their meals and conversations outside as I jumped out of my car and hurried inside. Panicked, the on-duty waitress came up to me and asked, "What's wrong, sir? You look like you've seen a ghost." Between ragged breaths, I explained my predicament and asked her if she knew the man in the black sedan, but she didn't, so she immediately offered refuge while we waited for the police. The seconds went by, and as the minutes went by, my anxiety increased. The sedan continued to pursue its goal outside, and my phone buzzed with a notification that my sister-in-law had sent me a news article about the suspected killer. The Victor Greiner is the smiling devil. I read about his vicious tactics and seemingly pointless crimes, and it sent shivers down my spine. He was smiling maniacally at onlookers who watched him easily torture his victim. I shared the terrifying article with the diner staff, and as we waited for law enforcement to respond, we looked up and saw those evil. It was almost 8 p.m. when headlights mysteriously vanished beyond the horizon. Victor Greiner had abandoned his target, leaving behind more questions than answers. I'm Doug Wilson, a truck driver by trade and a skeptic when it comes to the eerie and supernatural. And on a cold autumn evening, when this unsettling experience occurred, I was driving along a lonely stretch of road close to Woolbridge, Ohio, when my car unexpectedly broke down. You have to be kidding me. Ben Evans, my best friend and fellow truck driver, was doing his rounds nearby, so I called him to help out, What happened was that Doug got stuck in the mud again, and Ben reprimanded me as he came up to me. "That's funny," I said under my breath as I got out of the truck to check the problem. It felt good to have him around, even though after conducting a more thorough investigation, Ben confirmed that the truck required significant repairs and that we would be left stranded in the middle of nowhere. Our only option was to wait for backup help from headquarters, but our conversation quickly descended into morbidity when we spotted an abandoned building just down the road from where we were parked. The location screamed eerily with its broken windows. "It looks like it used to be a meat processing plant," I cautiously remarked as I looked at the rundown exterior. "I can't imagine what happened here." We talked about finding any leads regarding the building's mysterious past, and as interested as we were to investigate it further, a sensible sixth sense cautioned us not to go any farther. Tools out of my truck to kill time until help arrived, but while doing this routine task, we heard rustling noises that broke the eerie silence that loomed nearby. We exchanged uncomfortable looks, but we dismissed it as an animal darting through the underbrush until we noticed a strange silhouette out of the corner of our eyes. Panic struck, and we both began to perspire despite the cold night air. The figure looked quite tall. At first, it seemed to be limping towards us, but after a while, it accelerated its pace with an unnerving sense of resolve. With adrenaline pumping through our veins, our instincts took over, and we hurried back to the truck, yanking the driver's side door open out of fear and inability to think of a logical explanation for the man's violent behavior. We ultimately decided against. My heart pounded wildly as we faced it head-on, because we didn't even have a wrench to defend ourselves. Instead, we plucked up the courage to yell, "Hey, who the hell are you?" The figure didn't even harm our knee in response to our frantic plea. Instead, it seemed more determined to reach us, as if it realized we had discovered its hidden lair and now wanted to permanently silence us. My other half knew better than that. Ben looked equally conflicted, but had already made up his mind. "Doug, we can't stay here," he urged me with fervent exasperation as the fear surged through my chest like electricity from a high-voltage wire. Part of me wanted to stay and find out who or what this figure was, whether the person was in some kind of trouble and needed our help, or wanted a piece of the action himself. As I frantically attempted to crank up my worthless vehicle one last time, Ben had his eyes fixed on our tracker, and the figure was getting dangerously close. We had to leave, so we jumped into my broken-down truck and made room for each other on its metal floor, while exclaiming for a headquarters over our radio systems. He appeared to be waiting for the exact moment when we let our guard down about my decision to stay put in the false safety of my truck, to run barefoot through the devastated Ohio wilderness. I knew there wasn't much time left for me to make a decision, so I swallowed hard as Ben shook beside me and frantically whispered into my ear. Since it was dangerously obvious that our enigmatic stalker had no intention of leaving us alone, Ben and I decided to abandon the truck and run on foot. As his radio flicked between the scene below and the approaching threat, we had no choice but to do so. We hurried away from the wrecked car, gasping in the cold. It felt like the stranger would never give up, as if they were energized by our desperate escape attempts. Every time we thought we had gained some distance, those heavy footfalls were right behind us, like an unwavering spectre. Our only hope lay at a distant rest stop, where we figured out how to escape, with the night air and our legs pounding against the rough terrain. We dared not look back. It was a small cafe with a gas station attached, but it seemed like a safe haven in this merciless darkness. When we arrived at the rest stop, we staggered inside, alerting the few customers to our predicament. Their eyes widened at our unkempt appearance, but they immediately offered their assistance without question. In between gasps for Ray, we told them our story. Jim, a local, whispered that he recognized what we had described, and that it must be Elmer K. He used to work at that old meat processing plant before it closed years ago. Hearing Jim's stories about Elmer's troubled past only made us more terrified because it was true that the man had suffered a terrible accident at work that left him permanently disfigured and mentally unstable. As he described Elmer's numerous unnamed victims who had endured horrific deaths or severe injuries over the previous months, any doubt we had about his violent tendencies vanished like mist in the midday sun. As Jim spoke, it became painfully clear that Elmer was the epitome of cruelty and psychosis combined into one twisted maul of flesh. He was a dangerous man, unable to trust law enforcement to protect us from Elmer Kane, who had been lethal from the start. We chose to temporarily seek shelter in the Rest Stops diner. The staff there promised to do everything in their power to keep us safe from harm's way, but we knew deep down that they were just as terrified as we were. As the night wore on, we huddled close together in the diner as we waited for sunrise and a chance to escape. The weight of the situation weighed down on us like an oppressive storm cloud, and even with vigilant eyes watching us and steady hands holding makeshift weapons, we couldn't help but feel helpless and vulnerable. However, every minute that passed suggested a terrible realization. Something was amiss. Something was amiss. Outside in the chilly night air, we were unaware of how terribly mistaken we had been to believe we were safe until a sudden crash broke our slumbering vigilance. A bloody, mangled mess greeted us as we dared to look at what had once been the door to our sanctuary, and among that gory carnage stood none other than Elmer Kane himself. It seemed as though there were no limits to his wrath, his determination unwavering in pursuit of as chaos erupted throughout the diner. I locked eyes with Ben. It felt like an unwritten agreement that neither of us could die here without trying, until our very last breath. So we started a final desperate struggle for survival against a man who could not be reasoned with or reason with. His prey's heart sank in terror, but there was little time left for thinking or planning. I'm not typically one to let fear control me, but as the sun sank below the horizon, a cloak of darkness crept over the town of Ellis Park, Illinois, and an abyss that seemed to go on forever would turn into an enduring memory characterized by blood, suffering, and despair get the better of me after all. My name is Clyde Hennessy, and I worked as a truck driver 4 years, zigzagging across this huge country and running into my fair share of oddities along the way. Tonight was different, even for me. Don't worry, Clyde, I muttered as I locked my cab, trying to calm myself. You've been through worse. An odd smell filled the air, slightly metallic mixed with something strong. The moon shone brightly in the night sky, creating eerie shadows on the cracked concrete lot where I parked my rig. I started to walk slowly past an unknown alleyway, on my way to a local diner for coffee and grub. But before I knew it, I came across a shoe that had some drips of what appeared to be fresh blood on it. The silence was broken by a blood-curdling scream from an invisible source, and I frantically covered my ears as I looked around in all directions, feeling vulnerable but unsure of what to do next. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure, dressed in black, was approaching me. It appeared to be a man, but there was something seriously wrong with him. He was a tall man with broad shoulders who was elongated and slumped forward, arms swinging menacingly with every step. My instincts told me to run for assistance or call for backup, but oddly, something inside of me prevented me from warning others or creating a scene that might cause trouble for myself. The closer he got, the more his eyes gleamed with malice beneath a disheveled mop of oily hair, and his ebony clothing was stained with blood and some other unidentified filth. I knew that calling for help in this situation would be irrational because it was too late to change anything. Does that make me a coward? Maybe a toothy smile then appeared from that demonic visage. His shutters shook my body. A particularly rancid smell emanated from him as he got within inches of me. I studied his face. Clearly not ordinary people were left scarred and afraid in his wake, their limbs twisted and distorted beyond repair, and his foul breath fanned across my face. It dawned on me that it might be him, the notorious Christopher Franco, known for his heinous and sadistic crimes. His gruesome stories about him floated in my memory. As he leaned in and whispered menacingly into my ear, sending beads of sweat down my neck, he said, "I've been waiting for you, Clyde." Suddenly, I remembered the blood-stained shoe and the scream from earlier. Fear swept through me like a tidal wave, and I made a weak attempt to stop whatever Tira Franco was about to unleash. I swung my fist at him, but he caught it perfectly, allowing me to escape his vice-like grip. I tried to twist away, but the impact didn't cause the pain I expected. Instead, it sent me sprawling onto the cold, hard ground, grasping at my senses and still reeling from the shock he grabbed. My strength, hopelessness, and desperation caused distorted laughter to erupt from beneath the shadows as Franco raised his other arm high above us. In brief moments of insight, I tried desperately to find a way out of this agony. I looked around and saw a nearby garage toolbox. My mind elevated as I devised a plan I could try to grab something from. Then, I grabbed a nearby chain and slashed it across my back. The sudden searing pain brought me to my knees, dragging a guttural groan from deep within me. Anything that might help me repel this monster, so I summoned all of my remaining strength and launched myself toward the toolbox, looking back for a moment. Franco followed my movements with slow, deliberate steps, and as he got closer, I quickly swung the wrench at him, hitting his head, causing him to stagger back for a moment before quickly regaining his footing. Realizing that this fight was pointless, I focused on getting help. If I couldn't kill him by myself, maybe someone else could. Franco seemed to read my thoughts, as he fixed me with a chilly stare and a twisted smile before vanishing into the darkness as swiftly as he had appeared. My entire body trembled in terror, wondering if there was any use in calling for help. Christopher Franco would have been long gone by the time anyone arrived. There were many stories about people pursuing him, but no one ever apprehended him or even seriously injured him. I needed to learn anything I could about him, and perhaps even share it with law enforcement. At the very least, I needed to approach late-night pedestrians passing by whispers and tell them how they narrowly avoided his clutches. As the days went by, the connections between these stories and the man I had seen solidified the experiences of those unfortunate enough to have encountered Franco, and the gas station attendant Sally told me how she had been attacked weeks prior, but somehow managed to escape his grasp. She tearfully showed me a row of stitches sewn across her neck, a picture of an unbeatable monster. I knew I had to take action to break the cycle of suffering for all the residents of this godforsaken town. But would that even be feasible? With every action I took to reveal this monster, it only seemed to pose a greater threat than it had previously, so I was persuaded to notify the local authorities concerning Christopher Franco's presence in Ellis Park. But as I approached the police station door with dread in my heart, I noticed something uncanny. Deep footprints etched on the cracked pavement that tentatively rounded a corner and followed the sinister trail until I found myself back in the empty alley where it all started. The footprints abruptly ended at the blood-stained show left behind days ago. I was overcome with a sense of dread and knew that there was no way out of Christopher Franco's hold on Loves Park. Despite my cautious and slow steps, I couldn't help but wonder when he would strike again, and how many more people would suffer before the town figured out how to put an end to their most terrible nightmare. Then it hit me, perhaps Christopher Franco was more than just one man. Rather, he was a constantly expanding symbol of something much darker that existed in Loves Park, and that no one could ever stop or contain. It was only anticipated with terror by everyone who lived there, and so Loves Park continues to be haunted by Christopher Franco's shadowy presence and actions, and its residents continue to live in fear. Their so-called safe haven is tainted by an unstoppable evil, and they must come to terms with the fact that they are all potential victims of this vicious predator. My name is Elliot Summers, and it's not often that you find yourself at the center of a real-life horror film. It all started at a truck stop off the interstate in Amarillo, Texas, I had just finished filling up my 18-wheeler with gas and was anticipating my friend Dean Ison, another driver we'd met a few years ago during some downtime between hauls, was walking over with hands cupping to cups of steaming coffee and laughter that sounded like cartoon speech. I loaded my burnt coffee into the truck cabin and climbed up, sighing in the comfortable embrace of my worn driver's seat before we hit the road again. Bubbles, have you heard the story of the truck driver who asked with a smile if he had remembered to put on his clothes before weighing in? I laughed and shook my head, saying, "Nope, tell me well." He turned to his co-driver and said, "Oh no, it looks like our weight is in the newt zone." Dean laughed at his own joke, which was funny, and I laughed as we sat in our respective rigs as we talked about our future routes and small talk shifted to our favorite restaurants on the rude side of Interstate 40. I saw someone observing us from a distance, but I couldn't see anything of him except for his long silhouette against the setting sun. He stood there still as we carried on our conversation without realizing it, and when I turned back to confront him once more after telling Dean another story, the stranger left me feeling uneasy, but I didn't think much of it because, after all, we frequently encounter strange people in our hallways. Dean and I decided to have dinner at our favorite restaurant, which is located just off exit 15 in Little Rock. We shook hands, and I returned to the freeway, with Dean following me. A few hours after having a good time, Dean and I were sitting in a booth at the diner looking over the menu. The local decor covered the walls with antique signs and paraphernalia, and we each ordered our respective comfort foods burgers for me while Dean got himself a meatloaf dinner. As I drove down the freeway, I couldn't quite get rid of that strange feeling of being watched that started to creep into every part of my mind. It was difficult to ignore what happened next as Dean ate his plate with gusto. The air grew cold as everyone saw the stranger who had been observing us earlier enter the diner. He appeared emotionless, wearing disheveled facial hair and rumpled clothing. The stranger looked directly into my eyes, his eyes so cold that it made my body tingle. Stopped in front of our booth for what seemed like an eternity before moving silently and without hesitation toward the restroom. I whispered to Dean about the experience at the truck stop earlier and how unsettling the whole situation felt. He was obviously not afraid to confront strangers, and he quickly finished his meal before moving toward the restroom with the intention of asking who this menacing figure was, or even just reprimanding him. Once he left, I kept my eyes on him, on every single person leaving the restroom the Dean entered. But after examining each departure for 10 long minutes, he never came out of the nooks and crannies of that drowsy diner's restroom. Nevertheless, it seemed to me that I couldn't wait any longer, and that I needed to check on Dean. So I cautiously made my way through the diner until I reached the restroom door. Turning, Dean's lifeless body lay in a heap in one corner, his face beaten and contorted unnaturally. My heart pounded hard in my chest, and I suppressed a scream as tears streamed down my face. I knew I had to call for help, but my hand shook so violently. The knob of the door creaked open, revealing a scene that made my stomach turn. Blood covered the walls like twisted pieces of artwork, and bits of gore were scattered across the immaculate white tiles that I fumbled with my phone until it flew out of my hand and broke on the floor. My legs gave out under me, and I collapsed helplessly onto those same blood-stained tiles. A few minutes later, an employee discovered me, and almost immediately after that, others gasped in horror at the terrible scene in front of them. As police arrived and questioned each witness separately, I choked out a story about our unidentified attacker's presence at the truck stop and the diner. The police searched every square inch of the crime scene, while other customers whispered to one another about what might have inspired this cold-blooded killer. Some even conjectured that he was incredibly adept at blending in with the crowd. At that point, a terrified diner staff member told me about a strange customer who had given off sinister vibes earlier that evening. Their account matched my description of our murderous stalker, with disheveled facial hair and it led Detective Sanders to take the lead on similar cases in nearby states where they thought a man named Carl Winters was connected to the grisly murders. Detective Sanders asked for my contact information to keep me updated on the investigation and assured me that everything would be done within their power. He had managed to elude capture because of his unpredictable behavior and the horrific nature of his crimes, and it was now evident to me why I felt such an uncontrollable dread about this person. He wasn't human. Instead, he was an embodiment of evil that left a trail of destruction wherever he went. Despite feeling empty without my friend by my side, life had to go on, and one day, while checking my mail, I received a letter containing newspaper clippings of Carl Winters' life. I nodded silently, my voice stolen by shock and grief. I had no other options, and I didn't want to risk facing Carl again, so I took a few days off from driving. I became obsessed with staying alive after learning about the most recent murders. The envelope had no return address, and I started to realize that he was watching and sending me a message that it wasn't over. Every graphic memento drove me farther into a vigilant state, never letting my guard down and continuously checking although years have gone by, and I've continued to live a life marred by fear and paranoia. The knowledge that death is just a step away as long as Carl Winters is free still lurks in the background. As I picked up my coffee and looked at the clock, I sighed with driving a relief truck could be boring, but it paid the bills, and I enjoyed the benefits, like traveling to new places in the US. My name is Eldridge Marfield, which is a strange name, but my friends called me Edge. Today's drive wasn't likely to offer anything new, because I had already traveled through this area of rural Alabama 100 times. Hey Edge, trying that gas station sandwich again? Fred, my fellow truck driver, laughed, before getting into his vehicle and driving away. I rolled my eyes, thinking, I can't help it. These sandwiches have an inexplicable hold on me. He waved goodbye, muttering that he would never understand my food preferences. As time went on, the picturesque scenery changed from lush greens to vivid oranges and reds, signifying the arrival of autumn. There was something unnerving about this place. No one had picked up that old place yet, but I set it in all its glory. From mountain vistas to open plains with seemingly endless horizons, both banality and wonder existed simultaneously. I pulled into a rest stop where an old wooden house stood in disrepair next to a pond that had become stagnant. The hair on my arm began to stand on end. Fred said into the radio, "Nope. It might cost more to make it habitable again than to tear it down and start anew." I took a moment to observe the house before getting back in my truck to continue my journey. It was just a curiosity. It wasn't until I got to a small town that everything changed. Across the street from an old convenience store, which was overlooked by an old water tower, stood a woman draped in. I pulled the truck to a screeching halt as I saw the woman in rags screaming in terror as she attempted to flee her captor, who was holding her by the arm tightly. What had begun as a routine day was abruptly turned into a chaotic one. The man holding the woman captive was big, heavily tattooed, and obviously insane. His eyes were wild, and his mouth twisted Ed into a terrifying grin. "Do something," she cried, staring directly at me as though begging for her life. I snatched up my tire iron and rushed at the man, hoping to surprise him. He let go of the woman's arm, and she collapsed to the ground in an instant. He turned to me, his teeth clenched in rage, and smacked the tire iron out of my hand with incredible speed and force. When my vision returned, I discovered that I was imprisoned inside a small cage made of rusted metal bars with an old padlock. Holding it shut, my wrists and ankles were painfully tight with coarse rope, and I had already received one punch before everything went black as his fist struck my face. Dozens of other men and women of all ages were also imprisoned in their own cages, scattered across a dimly lit area. I struggled with my bindings, but soon realized that my efforts were futile. I whispered to the young man confined next to me. "How long have you been here?" "Days," he replied, "once a week." His voice drained of hope. "He never speaks. He just comes in and takes one of the as we heard a chainsaw roar into action outside our confinement. Blood-curdling screams joined the caca. The madman started his methodical, brutal work as he approached my cage. They never came back. I looked around and saw a figure emerge from the shadows, stopping at each cage before choosing a whimpering victim huddled at the back of their enclosure. The faint smell of gasoline filled the air. As the days went by and the fear inside of me gradually started to consume every ounce of reason I could think of, I braced myself for what might be my last moments. The figure kept going from cage to cage until he reached mine. He paused for a moment, his icy eyes examining me, but instead of choosing me, he went on to the next one. I had to devise a plan before it was too late, because there was only one chance to survive this nightmare. It required careful observation and even greater risk, but I eventually discovered a daily routine that our captor followed. He was meticulous in his rituals, and the only predictability I could find was the only hope for an escape plan. With extreme care and precision, I began releasing the knots around my wrists, and when my fellow inmates saw what I was doing, some of them stared with a glimmer of hope in their eyes, while others looked away as if trying to avoid drawing attention to my actions out of fear of the consequences. If we were caught after several days of imprisonment, I knew that as long as our captor didn't notice my progress, I'd be able to get free in due time. This slight struggle against my restraints finally paid off when our captor temporarily left the warehouse for his job. After escaping captivity, I was able to move cautiously and silently through the dimly lit space, which was filled with victims from the past and present. The terrible stench intensified with every step, and bloodstains covered the floor from those who had died at hour. I knew that my window of opportunity to flee would be limited, because there wouldn't be enough time to get everyone out or even understand what I had just gone through. With my heart racing frantically in my chest, I sprang for the doors to make my escape. But first I needed keys, and almost miraculously I found a set hanging from with my heart thumping so loudly that it felt like it would burst through my chest. I pushed the heavy doors open 1 millimeter at a time, avoiding any squeaky hinges, knowing that this hasty attempt could be my last chance to escape alive. I slipped through the crack and out into the night. It's a terrible reality to know that I took out my cell phone and reluctantly dialed 911 once I was safely hidden behind trees and bushes beside the building, hoping that they would arrive in time to rescue my fellow prisoners before our captor discovered my escape and retaliated on those who were still inside. Days later, after I had recovered in the local hospital from the terrifying experience, investigators told me they had arrested Cyrus Eddington, a man who, driven by anger and pain from his violent upbringing and multiple mental illnesses, targeted innocent bystanders in his insane quest for power and control over other people's lives, while committing intricate yet senseless acts of violence. Despite the police's assurance that he was in jail awaiting trial for his crimes, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling when the news revealed that Cyrus disappeared from his cell without a trace just days later, knowing he was still at large looking for his next victims. It confirmed my uneasy suspicions that he might have associates working with him. Instead of being free from this nightmare, my amazing escape from that warehouse of horrors, I was left with restless nights and a persistent sense of dread. I'm Jarvis Lancaster, a truck driver by trade, and I'm always plagued by the thought that Cyrus Eddington is still out there, watching any of us from a distance. Truck driving can be a dull job at times, but that all changed when one job led to an experience I'll never forget. Apart from the crook sign that greeted guests with an eerie creaking sound and the inexplicable drone of cicadas rising from the fields, driving through the desolate dirt roads surrounding a small Kansas town felt normal enough. The first oddity happened just as I parked my rig outside the local diner for a good meal. A fellow trucker, whose name I can't recall, said something unsettling under his breath just before leaving, but bodies were everywhere. This place seemed to accumulate more scars than memories. He walked away with a shiver and quickly left. I dismissed his cryptic warning as nonsense, figuring that he would eventually become exhausted. I laughed as I remembered one of my favorite jokes. Why did the Scarecrow win an award? That one always seemed to lighten the mood when truck stops got weird as evening fell. Hit the road once more, and soon after, I noticed something strange. A glint of light at what appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse in the distance caught my attention, so I felt strangely compelled to investigate. I pulled over and headed towards it, the moonlit gravel crunching beneath my boots as I went, and when I arrived at the property, I was met with a number of rotting doors arranged against the crumbling wall. "That's strange," I muttered, before hearing faint cries from behind one of them. I felt compelled to pry open one of those doors, because I knew someone might be in danger, even though Littleton seemed like the last place such things would occur. As soon as it broke free, I saw a man with tape stretched behind his back and his arms bound tightly. He collapsed grotesquely over his mouth at my feet, and I asked in panic, "Who did this to you?" As I started to untie the man, my heart was racing as things took a sudden, dark turn, and he gasped. I didn't get a good look at him, and he was wearing a hooded shirt. "Please, you need to call for help." My phone signal was incredibly weak, and we had no choice but to head back to my truck as we hurriedly moved. As we approached it, rustling came from the tall grass surrounding us. Our panic grew, and I cursed my weak phone signal once more. We stopped when a figure appeared, a hooded man with a remarkably composed face covered in blood. The moonlight gleamed menacingly off the sharp hunting knife he was holding. "You thought you'd steal my prey," he sneered, then charged at me, his blood curling. By using my survival instinct, I swung at him with all of my force, missing only by slicing off a piece of his hood. With fury fumbling through my pockets, I managed to draw out my trusted pocket knife just in time to parry the blow. We battled violently, with desperate cries and frenzied grunting as each of us fought for control in the precarious battle under the moonlight. The hooded figure was far from normal and had no intention of stopping his heinous acts, ready for another fight that would undoubtedly push me to the limit. He reeled back in anger before regrouping and raising his weapon high above his head. Like an executioner, as weapons clashed again and adrenaline surged through my veins, I realized that ending this grisly affair was beyond outlandish, not just unlikely, but possibly impossible. The hooded man hesitated for a moment before running into the darkness as if vanishing into thin air. I let out a deep breath, the knife still clenched tightly in my hand, and as we continued our desperate dance of death, locked in a battle I knew was far from over. A police siren pierced the night as it approached our location at lightning speed. When the authorities arrived, I had the chance to assist the man I had saved. With the help of law enforcement, we were able to provide him with medical care and report our findings on this twisted situation. Over the next few days, the town was in a frenzy as murders and kidnappings had been occurring 4 months under everyone's noses, all carried out by a single man, Nathaniel Fletcher, who was eerily known as the police were unable to capture Nathaniel because he was always 2 steps ahead of them. His remarkable intelligence and vicious nature made him a formidable elusive foe despite the constant threats. The scourge of Littleton was revealed as horrifying details emerged from his hidden cellars, underground chambers, and makeshift surgical theaters on his property. I couldn't leave Littleton just yet, because I knew that my time would be a powerful tool against this heinous criminal. I made it my personal mission to make sure he would face justice by working tirelessly with law enforcement and community members who refused to cower in fear like their neighbors were doing. Together, we pieced together his grim tale, which revealed that he was a man who was filled with insatiable hatred and a thirst for revenge for his own horrific history of abuse and neglect in Littleton, motivated by hatred for those who hadn't stopped him from suffering for years. Nathaniel transformed his suffering into a repulsive career that sought to outdo anyone who attempted to stop him from torturing those he believed to be appropriate victims. We also found other victims who had been held captive, such as the man I had rescued, though somewhere at the motel where I was staying, I received a terrifying, taunting letter from Nathaniel Fletcher himself. It sent shivers down my spine and confirmed my worst fear years. Not only did he know who I was, but he also declared our fates were entwined in Littleton. They were thankful to have escaped Nathaniel's clutches alive despite their injuries. I knew that Nathaniel and I were far from over in our struggle for survival until one of us took our last breath. I was consumed by the desire to get rid of this murderous psychopath, but no matter how much evidence we gathered or strategies we devised against him, Nathaniel escaped. The last time I saw Nathaniel Fletcher was during a dramatic showdown on. Our battle was fierce and vicious, and as we fought on the roof of an abandoned industrial building, the structure began to collapse beneath us. Nathaniel realized he would be at a disadvantage in the rubble-filled room below, so he withdrew once more into the shadows, even though he had been seriously injured during our battles, and worried that his next move would come at any time. I made the decision to keep trucking because I couldn't stay paralyzed by fear any longer. My life's journey was now linked with the intention of making sure Nathaniel would be held accountable for his horrible deeds. So I made a PCT with myself that no matter how far or how wide my wheels took me, I would never stop looking for Steve. Said over the radio, "Hey Rob, I hope you're doing well, probably on a quick break." The temperature had dropped uncomfortably, signaling the arrival of winter. I tipped my trucker cap to the waitress at the truck stop diner and headed back to my rig, named Sir Hot. I checked my phone for a message from my wife Kayla, wishing me a safe trip back, and I got into the cab. 32, he was trucking about 60 meters away in the opposite direction. "Hey man, just passing by Picketville. Do you know anything interesting about this place?" I said, and Steve laughed briefly. "Oh, Buckville, you're in Blair Witch territory, buddy." We both laughed and decided to get back in touch as soon as I finished my route night. I decided it was time for a little pick-me-up. I said into my radio receiver, "Hey Jim," and after a moment, he complained, "Why couldn't the bicycle stand up by itself?" The atmosphere felt heavy, and a thick fog covered the road, obscuring a large portion of what lay ahead of me. I drove more cautiously. "Back all right, Rob?" "Why?" "Because it was too tired." I laughed heartily in response, and Jim moaned and returned to overseeing his fleet of drivers. Shortly after that conversation, things started to take an odd turn. The radio started to cut in and out on occasion, and news reports about an escaped murderer, Jonathan Atkins, caught my attention. Characterized him as dangerous and unpredictable, indiscriminately targeting victims. About 100 feet up the road, I noticed a strange silhouette coming out of the fog. As I approached, I noticed a man standing in the middle of the lane, motionless, soaked from head to toe, and clearly shivering. I couldn't just leave him stranded, so I decided to approach him carefully. I stopped, Sir Hot, and went up to the man through my partially lowered. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road and followed him. The air felt colder than ever as we continued into the murky mist, and as I spoke, I tried to sound friendly while noticing his obviously desperate state. "You need some help." The man gradually turned pale as the fog that surrounded us. "Please, can you help me? There's been an accident." "Is this a prank?" Could it have something to do with the elusive escaped murderer? An overturned car soon appeared in front of us, steam rising from its engine like an eerie appearance. As we got closer, I started to worrying about what might be inside. What if there were injured passengers? Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind us echoing through the dizzying fog. The strange man was gone. He had disappeared without a trace, and there was a murmur of distress ripped through my thoughts, leaving me frozen in place as my heart thumped fiercely in my chest. I took one last look around before deciding it was time to depart, without turning around to look at the wrecked car or look for the missing man in distress. I hurried to Sir Hallett, and with my heart racing, I ran back to my reliable rig, Sir Holall. I decided to call for help, because I needed someone nearby who could explain this mysterious situation. My shaky hands grabbed the radio and I tried to call Steve. Steve, are you there? Something's really wrong here. But static persisted. I climbed into the cab, slammed the door shut, and scanned the area to make sure I wasn't being followed. As I sat there thinking about what to do, a swirl of fog revealed a face staring at me from within the trees. It was Jonathan Atkins, the escaped murderer, and I knew something had happened not only to the man who had disappeared, but also at the accident scene. Knowing that he was out made my heart race. In order to protect myself from this extremely dangerous person, I decided on a very risky plan. I looked through my truck for anything useful and found a heavy wrench that could be used as a defense weapon. However, before I could decide what to do next, a bush rustled by my window, and a few seconds later, I noticed an injured woman. I quickly got out of my taxi, grabbed the wrench, and cautiously approached her as she struggled for conscious control. Every second counted now, and if Atkins were anywhere nearby, he would strike without warning or hesitation. But there was no time to stop her. She came out of the dense fog, her shirt soaked in blood, and she limped painfully towards me, pleading for help. My legs carried me as quickly as possible toward a nearby town that was barely visible through the fog. I pounded my way through the door of the first building that was lit, a small convenience store. Someone, please, there's an injured woman on the road, I yelled in desperation as I looked around at the confused faces. Waste on inner doubts or emotions. Their faces told me that they were aware that it had to do with Atkins, the killer they had been hearing about for days. The store owner immediately called the police and described the situation, and the locals decided to band together and defend their town from Atkins. They armed themselves with whatever baseball bats were available. With the help of fishing nets and hammers, we were able to quickly give them an idea of where we had found the wrecked car. We then started searching the area with extreme caution because the fog was still hiding Atkins' location. Suddenly, a scream broke through the air a few yards away, and I rushed towards it, clutching my wrench for dear life. What we found was a terrifying scene. We wanted to grieve for him and remember him as just like us, someone who merely wanted to live another day, but we couldn't afford that luxury. Seeing a young man who was already dead, his throat brutalized by a knife with precision that unnerved me in a matter of seconds. The only thing that matters now is finding and stopping as more victims fell victim to Jonathan Atkins' violent rampage. It became evident that we were dealing with a cunning, sinister individual who appeared to know every move we had made in the past. The days felt endless as we continued our merciless search through dense fog and despair, determined to protect our community and restore peace to our lives. We eventually found a hidden lair in the woods that contained evidence of Atkins' unspeakable wrongdoings after endless searching and terrifying encounters with tragedy after tragedy. As we carefully searched the area, the dreaded realization dawned on us. Jonathan Atkins had surreptitiously watched every move we made and had been waiting for us here in his secret nest. In spite of this terrifying realization, Atkins himself remained elusive and never visible. His icy gaze seemed to pierce the trees as he watched us struggle for hope, and in the last moments, when it mattered most, he slipped through our fingers like fog dissipating on a summer breeze. That day appeared to be just another awful day. Thursday. I'm Clifford Barkley, a truck driver by trade, and I live in Wise, Idaho. I picked up my load in the morning and headed out on the road, not realizing how drastically my life would change. At first, the drive was uneventful, with chatty radio hosts telling cheesy jokes and long stretches of open road paths by my window as I haul goods across America. Soon, though, I passed through the gory inciting. I stopped at a roadside diner sometime after midnight with the intention of getting coffee and cracking a joke with another tired traveler or two. As we entered the brightly lit area, the incident happened on a small stretch outside of Boise, where a squished deer lay mangled on the asphalt. Its central stretched across the freeway like some horrifying Jackson Pollock painting that started my terrible encounter. The well-lit area appeared to be just another ordinary American diner, until I noticed a man sitting at the counter, huddled over his coffee cup, wearing filthy denim overalls. His menacing appearance sent chills down my spine, because his face was covered in deep scars that were all too similar to a grotesquely carved pumpkin. The stranger's smirk made me uneasy for some reason that only stubborn men can explain. I chose to sit next to him anyway, acting as though nothing could bother me. Call it stupidity or bravado, but just as I was about to say one of my well-known icebreaker jokes, a tangible feeling of terror kept me silent. Instead, there was something strangely familiar about this man, as if I had met him or had seen him in a nightmare whose specifics were he was the serial killer from the news reports, and those crazy neighborhood grapevine stories, the one who preyed on innocent truck drivers just like me. I had quickly forgotten this when I woke up, and it wasn't until he asked me who I was talking to on my phone a few moments ago that I realized. My heart stopped in my throat, and nausea drained my face of all color. While trying to catch my breath, I considered my options. Would there be enough time to call the police? Would he even be here when they arrived? My hands shook as anxiety threatened to paralyze me with fear. It was nearly impossible not to recognize him at that moment. The man's attention seemed to shift away for a few moments, giving me an opportunity to excuse myself and rush into the restroom. Indecisive terror as the seconds passed. I heard footsteps coming toward the bathroom door. I felt a throbbing fear build up in my chest as I forced myself to hold my breath and carefully slipped into a stall. His eerie laughter then filled the room, making me feel as cold as ice. I knew I had to do something while fighting to keep my calmness. I came up with a plan in my head, and since I had no other choice, I chose to try to get out of the diner without being noticed. When the laughter stopped and his shadow vanished beneath the bathroom door, I carefully stepped out of the stall and crept to the bathroom entrance. When I looked inside the diner, I saw that he had gone back to his seat at the counter, so I knew it was my chance to move. Before picking up the receiver, I noticed the local newspaper left on a table nearby. The front page headlines screamed about yet another murder by the truck stop killer, a man named Theodore Crane. Using any cover the diner's interior offered, I approached a nearby payphone to alert the authorities. Suddenly, it all made sense to him how he knew things. Theodore was the vile monster who committed all those heinous murders, and he had no business knowing how he seemed strangely familiar, as if fate had brought him right here, where I sat. Knowing that time was running out before Theodore Crane became suspicious of my absence, I called the 911 operator quickly, but quietly, and the operator answered my distressed call, and I frantically whispered all the important details about my surroundings without giving away too much. When I was back near my table, I secretly looked for any other exits besides the main door. On one of the booth tables, I noticed an emergency exit hidden behind a decorative poster. I was slowly making my way to it, taking every precaution to avoid drawing attention to myself. As soon as I got there, I looked back a few times to make sure Theodore had not yet left his seat when a serving waitress with an overflowing tray unexpectedly blocked my attempt to pry open the exit door. After what seemed like an eternity, the waitress finally moved aside, and I managed to escape through the rear entrance. The cold air exacerbated the chill radiating from my sheer terror as I ran to my truck, and as I unlocked the door with trembling hands, my heart raced as I pulled away from the diner and sped down the highway in a desperate attempt to get as far away as possible. Only a few miles down the road, the comforting sound of police sirens approaching in the distance gave me a strange sense of relief, but considering Theodore's sly demeanor thus far, it was difficult to believe he would be easily captured. In the back of my mind, I knew that I had done everything I could to permanently leave Theodore behind and notify the police of his presence. Roadside diner. I had a disturbing hunch that this man, this monster, was beyond all human comprehension. Every murder he committed was an act of utter brutality. I was plagued by a persistent fear that I would never be able to completely escape him, that I would never forget what I had witnessed, and that his name would continue to haunt me. The road stretched eerily in front of me, and all I could do was drive. It seemed unlikely that Theodore Crane could or would ever be caught, and I wasn't sure if there would ever be a cliffhanger in this gory story, or if anyone who had met this blood-chilling man could truly understand what was left in his dark wake. But a tiny voice deep inside me held out hope that maybe one day a truck driver named Jasper Callahan, and I've always had a way of keeping things light-hearted and cracking jokes. If it weren't for me, it might end for someone else who hasn't yet met the truck stop killer Theodore Crane. It happened during a Wednesday evening shift, and I can't get those terrible memories out of my head. That day, like all others, began fairly routinely. I stopped at Bucky's Diner in rural Mississippi to unload some supplies as usual. The staff was welcoming, and the establishment wasn't a rundown for a stop on long hauls. As I finished up and resumed my journey, it didn't take me long to realize that something wasn't right. There had been multiple reports regarding truckers have been terrorized by a mysterious presence during their night shifts. Other drivers have even told stories about a vicious-looking man with bloodshot eyes and an eerie smile, but his motivations were unknown. As they say, we have more stories about truckers than Shakespeare could ever write. 1,000 years before I knew it, dusk had arrived like an unwanted guest, putting its cold arms around the familiar home of my big rig's engine, patrolled the almost deserted highway as the sun set. As I passed through a heavily forested area, a thick fog rolled over the road. Eventually, my GPS warned me that I needed to turn down an old country road, which turned out to be unusually narrow and dimly lit. That's how horror movies start, and I laughed to myself as I made my way down this new path. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Plastic bags filled with glass fragments and pieces of rotting flesh were scattered across the road in front of me. Horrified by this mob scene, I instantly stopped my truck and jumped out to get a better look at everything. Curiosity prodded me like 1,000 rusty fish hooks, and fear responded by yelling for me to run. My radio crackled and cut to the sound of a deep, sinister laugh that suddenly a powerful engine roared in the distance, approaching my location at a spine-chilling pace. Before I could react, a battered truck tore through the fog, its blinding headlights bearing down on me like a relentless hound. I desperately tried to contact the Saints or any other drive around my frequency, but no one seemed to be around. I was so paranoid that I rushed back into my rig and narrowly shot it down the road as my radio continued to taunt me with sinister laughter that made my skin crawl. Beast, I jumped out of the way just in time as broken glass and debris rained down upon where I had been standing. I was desperate for help and unsure of what was happening. A moment later, I noticed lights in my side mirror. It was another truck, and the driver looked disheveled in the dim light of his cab, just as the legends had described him. The road seemed to go on forever, now enclosing me on all sides as panic clawed at my chest. I looked back in front of me, but an imposing figure blocked my path. A bloodied and mangled body scattered across the road, and had to silently apply the brakes to prevent it from slamming. I screeched to a stop and couldn't resist patting the dashboard of my reliable truck. "Well, buddy, we've gotten out of worse situations before." I tried to joke, but a thud echoed through my truck as something heavy slammed against it from behind, without warning or reason, and I'm now terrified beyond belief. Measure whimpering, sweating, and by myself, I concluded that the only way out was to face this unknown terror head-on. I could no longer run or avoid it. It was time, as if fate had decided with me. A terrifying figure appeared in front of my truck. The figure was a man with bloodshot eyes and an eerie smile that matched the descriptions from the legends, and his clothing was stained with. I knew I had to do everything in my power to stop this maniac before he could take more innocent lives. So I quickly grabbed my tire iron from the passenger seat and silently prayed that I wouldn't have to use it. After taking a deep breath to calm myself, I approached the killer cautiously. He didn't appear surprised by my presence or the blood in his hands. Instead, he flashed a spooky smile as though he was waiting for me to strike. His weapon swung wildly as he charged at me, and my instincts took over. I swung the tire iron in defense, making contact with the sickening thud. The force sent him reeling back, but it didn't seem to deter him in the least because I was no match for him physically. I clambered back into my truck and slammed on the gas G pedal. The operator's voice rang first in my ear. I frantically tried to put distance between us as I drove away. "Hello, yes. There's a man, he's chasing me, he's killing people," I muttered over the phone. "Okay, sir. Stay calm, where are you?" I said. "Now," the operator asked. "I'm on old Route 45 near Mount Marker 12, and I replied, "Hang on tight," my hands shaking as my truck sped down the road. "I'm sending help your way," she said reassuringly, but even though her words were meant to console me, they only made me feel worse because of how hollow they sounded in the midst of this terror, knowing time was of the essence. Essentially, with adrenaline still pumping through my veins, I continued driving in the hopes of meeting the police halfway. When I saw the flash of blue and red lights up ahead, relief swept over me, and I pulled over, prepared to share what I had experienced. A number of police cars surrounded me, and an officer came to my window and asked, "What's going on here?" Concerned, I told the officer everything, including the truck driver killer's legends and my encounter with him moments earlier. The officer nodded gravely as I told my story, and a few minutes later, more squad cars arrived, and they promptly organized a search for this ruthless terror. Despite their best efforts that night and in the days that followed, no sign of the vicious killer was ever discovered, but my truck contained evidence. The authorities tried to reassure me that they were doing everything in their power to find him and bring him to justice, but even with their assurances, the legend became very real to me. He is now a nameless, faceless terror who roams those roads with malicious intent, and the images of what he did to those who were unfortunate enough to encounter him haunt me every night in my dreams. The sense that he might still be out there watching me persisted like an unspoken truth. Whether it was divine intervention or pure luck that let me get away from him be known, but while some people may continue to tell those stories, over campfires or over the radio in long hauls, one thing is certain: this horrific killer did exist in the real world, and neither I nor anyone else could really sleep easy. I'm Ethan Harrington, and I never imagined that driving a truck would ever put me in this predicament. As I'll explain, it was just another day, and my route took me across California from the bustling metropolis of Los Angeles to the ethereal redwoods up north. The sun had already started to set behind the horizon. My back hurting from hours behind the wheel, I pulled up to a sleepy truck stop for some much-needed rest. I was excited to stretch my legs when I heard a loud crack nearby, like the snapping of bones, and my headache seemed so unimportant that the lot went silent. I cautiously looked around, taking in the other drivers who had additionally. They halted their conversation in the middle of a sentence, and we all looked around uneasily, laughing nervously, and dismissed the sound as someone dropping something large. I reassured myself that maybe it was just firewood being split at one of the nearby campsites, since nothing sinister had ever happened in this area of the woods before, so there was never a dull day on when we went into the diner connected to the truck stop for food and shelter. I joked with another driver. Strangely, that strangely loud sound somehow brought us closer together as strangers in solidarity. Laughter came naturally as we shared stories over coffee and dubious lasagna before finally leaving into the night once more with obvious reluctance. However, one sound led to another, the sound of tiny animals scuttling. I clambered back into my truck cab with recitations of "Drive safe" ringing shallow in my ears. My gut instinct prevented me from starting the engine, and my breathing became shallow in the quiet darkness as it gradually intensified into a feeling of impending danger. Across hidden paths, things suddenly became tense. An unknown weight filled our steps even after we left our newfound acquaintances inside. Doom. It only took me a moment to realize that I couldn't just sit there defenseless and unprotected, so I fumbled in my glove box for my worn pocket knife. A little farther down the line of trucks and trailers, though I could only see a blur, something evil lurked at the edge of my peripheral vision. Whoever they were, they either moved or spoke, and even though it's easy to dismiss fear, that shadow felt impossibly bone-chillingly incorrect. One of them moved slowly and deliberately towards me from between the shadows cast by a row of tires on a parked truck. From the brief glimpse, I could make out strange angled limbs, but I didn't have time to process them as I fumbled with the knife in my trembling hands. Suddenly, two more joined their partner, and they moved with unwavering purpose, and as I stood up to lock the cab door, a fourth figure appeared, taller than the others, and I realized there was no more room for escape or denial, because these twisted shadows weren't just illusions brought on by fatigue. They were deadly real and terrifyingly fast. My heart was thumping wildly now, that our eyes had met. Nowhere to run separated me from reality, but one thing was for sure. Leaving myself exposed seemed like an even worse decision. I briefly considered trying to start up my truck and escape this nightmare before it reached me. But even if my hands weren't shaking violently, or if they didn't seem so impossibly swift, I couldn't hide anymore. Before I could even take a breath to prepare myself, an unexpected explosion of screaming broke the blackened air around me. The scream came from Samantha, a waitress from the diner, who had raised their hand towards me as if beckoning me forth, like a fisherman baiting his prey. Fully aware of what was happening, she went outside to take a break and smoke a cigarette. She stared in terror at the approaching figures, knowing that whatever was happening was not something she wanted. Her screams seemed to temporarily stop the figures, so I swiftly unlocked my truck door and sought cover in the cab with the other drivers. Since it would be too dangerous to start my engine and try to drive away, I decided to call 911 and try to explain the situation to the dispatcher in clear and urgent terms. They promised to send help right away and told me to stay where I was, including details about my uniform like GAR. Everyone hardly clambered into their own trucks, realizing they should be getting as far away from these beings as possible, started to take shape, and even though it was hard to see their faces, I could tell they were dangerous people who might have been a member of a violent or even murderous gang. Minutes passed that seemed like hours, and the tension in the air was heavy. I hoped that law enforcement would arrive soon, but it seemed more likely that they wouldn't get to us in time. Gathering my courage, I bounded out of the safety of my truck cab with the pocket knife clenched firmly in hand, cutting through the cold darkness towards where they held Samantha captive. I shouted at them in an attempt to divert their attention, and the commotion attracted some other drivers who joined me. Over time, my fear increased exponentially when I saw these figures approaching Samantha. Their intentions were obviously less than benign, leaving me with no choice but to intervene. I was able to save Samantha because of their presence, which gave me more strength. We formed an alliance against these evil invaders, and as adrenaline shot through our veins when they saw their friend in danger, we fought a desperate but improvised battle. Our efforts seemed to be working, as they hesitated, trying to decide whether the risk of continuing the assault was worth it. All four of them were uneasy when sirens suddenly sounded through the night. It seemed as though God had heard our request, because police cars skittered onto the scene, scattering dust and gravel behind them. Samantha was able to escape their hold and make her way to us and the safety of the arriving officers. The armed gang members then fled into the night like we stood there as the victorious heroes, but we couldn't get rid of the dreadful thought that this was not yet over. One of the truckers who had assisted me during the altercation was an army veteran who was skilled at identifying badges and insignia. and he recognized the attackers as being a member of a ruthless criminal cartel headed by his police took our statements about the incident and made sure Samantha was safe. We couldn't help but look anxiously over our shoulders. Razor Gregory is known for his particularly brutal and ruthless methods, and it became clear to me that we had only won a battle and not the war. Yes, we expected retaliation at any moment, but days went by without any incidents, and life returned to normal, without any help from our assailants. We knew better than to let our guard down entirely. However, Razor Griffin and his gang continued to be active in their quest for mayhem and violence in other parts of California. And as I returned to work as a truck driver, I couldn't help but think that they were still out there, and we somehow knew they would during a typical stop at the Smoky Point Rest area in Arlington. I found myself once again in this never-ending cycle of violence and retribution, which didn't seem satisfactory at all. My life became permanently tinted with uncertainty and a newfound vigilance, leading me to worrying every day whether it had been my last. As I stepped out of my truck and stretched my stiff limbs, I couldn't help but notice how unusually quiet everything seemed. Even the wind in the trees seemed to hold its breath. There was something particularly unsettling about the heavy silence that enveloped me. I shook off the creeping unease and strode toward the restroom building, eager for some semblance of normalcy. While washing my hands at ACCCKSN, I sparked a conversation with Morris Powell, another trucker we discovered that we had much more in common than just our profession when he was recently fired from his previous job. Our shared love of online humor soon led to us exchanging jokes and laughing at our own foolishness. As they say, laughter is contagious, Morris said through chuckles, and I suppose that's true, since we're both infected. After our laughter subsided, I noticed something through the grimy. I shouted as Morris and I went outside to confront the man who was standing near my truck through the restroom window. He appeared unervingly normal as he casually dug through one of the storage compartments on the side of the trailer. The man didn't even acknowledge our presence or budge, so we approached him cautiously until his head abruptly turned to face us, revealing eyes that held nothing but the man on my gate, still unflinching in his lock, started to peel back his lips to reveal teeth that appeared to belong more to a carnivorous animal than a human. He stared into my soul with malice and an all-consuming hunger for dread, as if it were a feast laid out before him. I was horrified, but neither Morris nor I could manage much more than stammering in confusion and horror. Once human Morris broke free from the man's grasp, Jake said, "We need to call for help." His urgency brought me back to reality, and I realized that my phone was in my truck. If there was a landline inside, Morris fled back into the bathroom, and I hurried to the truck driver's side door, fumbling with my keys out of fear that was making it hard for me to breathe. I glanced back at the man as he ripped through the final piece of metal that separated him from the contents of my truck that I had punched in 9/11s. But there was no comforting click of someone coming to my aid. I closed the door and walked back toward Morris, my heart racing and my hands clammy with sweat from terror. The man maintained his savage gaze on me, but he now approached me with a purposeful gait that showed that he was enjoying the moment. The glint in his eyes sharpened as he saw Morris, and without hesitation or warning, he slammed his hand against Morris's head with force. He had pulled something out of my truck, a longer rusted chain, that he dragged behind him with cruel intent. Morris joined me as the nightmare-inducing figure stepped even closer. The twisted grin on that flesh-hungry fiend's face only seemed to widen when he saw our shock and dismay with Morris writhing in agony on the ground. The severity of our situation was evidently clear, and neither of us had the means to adequately fight back against this monstrous attacker. Unimaginable howling screams tore from Morris's throat at a pitch that would haunt me for eternity if I survived this ordeal. I found a discarded tire iron and tried to use it as a defense weapon, but the man just smiled and raised the chain high above his head, ready to strike. I swung the tire iron directly at him with all the strength I could muster because I felt that, despite my own extreme fear, I couldn't leave my new friend in pain. I was shocked and relieved when it hit his arm with a sickening crunch of bone meeting metal. The man howled in pain and dropped the chain as he staggered backward. Seizing the chance, I rushed over to Morris and attempted to pull him away from the gory scene as fast as I could. However, I wasn't strong enough to carry him, so instead we staggered awkwardly on our slow retreat toward my truck through labored breathing. Morris begged me, "Please, you," as we continued our slow escape. We noticed that our sinister pursuer was recovering remarkably quickly from his injury. He stood up again, blood dripping from his wounded arm. But he seemed unfazed and began to head toward us with an expression that suggested diabolical retribution. I tried calling for help, but my phone didn't work, and I gasped, "We just need to leave this place." Returning to the truck stop apron, we saw another driver who had finally come out from behind his parked rig, pleading for any help against this relentless stalker. I pleaded with the stranger, "Please, we need your help. This man attacked us." And after he hesitated, he tentatively approached us, staring at our aggressive assailant before turning back to. When he got closer, it seemed like he realized how serious our situation was. "What is that guy doing?" he stammered. "I don't know," and I started to pant as my fatigue started to set in, but he wouldn't stop. "We need to call the police." The stranger took out his phone and dialed 911, successfully alerting law enforcement. We continued our retreat until hours later, Morris the stranger and I were sitting in a warm well-lit diner, just off the highway, waiting for police officers to arrive. We shared stories about the terrifying events that had happened, and we discovered that our attacker was a man, Leonard Harris, who was sadistic and infamous for leaving victim trails across the area. We had managed to get a reasonably safe distance from the lurking menace. While driving to my next delivery destination, I noticed something written in bold letters on one of my truck mirrors that read, "I'll see." I thought back on my brief but terrifying encounter with Leonard Harris as I left the truck stop and headed back on the road after giving my statement to the police. Many questions still lingered in my mind, including why he didn't finish us off after my desperate tire iron blow and what he wanted from us. The idea of running into Leonard Harris again made me shudder. The haunting encounter would never leave me. Every smile I had was a chilling reminder that some threats are just waiting for their next chance. The air was crisp and cool as I carried the load across the United States, driving my 18-wheeler to its destination. My name is Jarvis Gilman, and I've always been a good truck driver. I've always enjoyed solitude, but right now I might have enjoyed some company. I had stopped at a little-known diner off the main highway, and it seemed like a good place to have a local fare and strike up a conversation with the nice people of Empelia, Idaho. An elderly man sitting close by laughed heartily as I started eating my sandwich and gave me a wise, humorous look. "Young man," he said, "did you know that this area was once terrorized by a famous, unidentified serial killer? Locals called him the Beast, but no one ever got a good look at him. They say he simply slipped away into the shadows like fog escaping. Naturally, I laughed at his story through your fingers, because who wouldn't enjoy a good story about a legendary threat? Then, I smiled, hoping that he had changed his ways by now. After exchanging pleasantries, we parted ways, with me returning to the road and him heading to parts unknown. A few hours later, I was parked close to an industrial complex not far from my place. It was getting late, and I needed a little extra coffee to keep me alert for the rest of the trip. My tired legs were pushing me in the direction of my cab's sleep compartment when I realized that I had left my thermos back at the diner. I was prepared to get back on track, but then I noticed it sitting on top of a little pile of trash bags not far from my truck, in what appeared to be an abandoned parking lot, and as I got closer, I saw a man with dark, barely distinguishable features. My stomach turned, but I was determined to get my lost treasure, so I stepped forward and blurted out a feigned friendliness. "Hey there. "Thanks for finding my thermos." The strange figure said nothing, and his motion remained motionless as the grave became curious. The shadowed figure lunged at me with a sudden force that knocked me off balance and pinned me down against the ground, one hand gripping my throat with a vice-like strength. My vision blurred as the menacing silhouette hovered over me, and I knew without a doubt that this was the beast. I was worried, my breath caught in my throat, and fear urged me to flee, my instincts warning me of an impending threat as I struggled against an overwhelming foe. My instincts went into overdrive, and every desperate breath fueled the terrors of helplessness. A sharp stab of pain pierced my leg, and a serrated knife carved deep into flesh and muscle, causing blood to ooze from the fresh wound. Despite the sensation of searing hot iron coursing through my veins, I was able to grasp the assailer's arm blindly, frantically tearing and clawing for freedom. I was able to push the attacker off me and pried his hand from my throat with a sudden burst of strength. I stumbled to my feet, my vision blurry, and looked around for a way out, but the parking lot was empty, with no cars or people nearby, so I couldn't call for help because no one was there to hear me. The beast got back up on his feet. Under the dim glow of a nearby lamppost, his heavily scarred face and menacing grin were now clearly visible. His bloody knife and the murderous intent in his cold eyes gleamed dangerously in the dim light. Acting out of pure survival instinct, I grabbed an abandoned metal pipe from nearby debris, preparing myself for a life-or-death battle with him across the darkened lot. We circled warily like a sudden distant echoing noise served as the signal for him to strike lightning fast, like a pit viper, as he lunged forward aiming for my chest. The air became thick with tension as we drew closer together, and my heart pounded wildly with each step. I tried to concentrate only on anticipating his next vicious move. Experience avoiding dangers while driving. I used my makeshift weapon to block his attack and struck him hard in the face. The beast stumbled backward for a moment, but he appeared unfazed, as if his well-developed sense of pain had long since vanished in the twisted maze of scars etching his skin. He smiled excitedly, as though this cat and mouse chase had just begun. Not until seconds turned into minutes did I notice another figure on the edge of my vision, someone watching our struggle with keen but scared eyes. The observer seemed familiar, and in the heat of the moment I briefly recognized him as the old man from the diner. With no end in sight, we continued our violent dance, jabbing and dodging, swinging recklessly, but defending fiercely. Tiny glimmer of hope, but his hands stayed clasped in front of him in silent terror. Rather than reaching for assistance, I saw his lips form a name. Thomas Grimm. The beast paused as though he saw his unwanted witness, then turned his icy glare in his direction. In that brief moment of distraction, I slammed into the old man with my full weight. Grimm fell with a gasp, his knife clattering across the pavement as he hit it. Seeing an opportunity to flee, I limped as quickly as my injured leg would allow to my truck, threw open the door, and climbed into the cab. All thoughts of going back the way I had started vanished as adrenaline drove me forward until the distance ate up any chance of what might have happened. Had turned into my worst nightmare, fulfilling his silent vow to return weeks later. After recovering at home from my horrific experience, I learned that Thomas Grimm was a notorious local figure. Before going missing years earlier, his brutal tactics and extraordinary ability to avoid capture had made him a legendary figure, and rumors circulated among those who dared to recall the beast of Montpelier, Idaho. One truth remained: sometimes monsters hide among us in plain sight. It was strange as I grew kinder and started my daily job as a truck driver. Perhaps telling others about his twisted tale would make them more cautious. Perhaps revealing Grimm's identity would put crosshairs on my back instead. Driving through the tiny town of Acme, Pennsylvania, I noticed something odd on the windshield of my reliable semi-truck. It was a strangely shaped red splatter that gave me goosebumps and kind of looked like a sinister face with a twisted grin. I shrugged it off and continued driving, because you never know what strange things you'll come across in this line of work. I was driving through the fog-covered hills of Pennsylvania when I noticed something even stranger. My phone kept buzzing with missed calls from an unknown number. I finally got so frustrated with this persistent caller that I pulled over to the side of the road to answer it. "Hello," I barked into the phone as the person driving next to me whispered in a panicked hoarse voice. My voice trailed off as I looked in the side mirror behind me and saw a truck that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "Ignore him," the menacing voice hissed over the phone, but how could I ignore them? They were stuck to my tailgate at an uncomfortable distance, and I felt trapped and bewildered by this nightmare on wheels. I tried to get rid of him by speeding up, but instead Phil Moore, a kind father of 3 children and an aspiring comedian who was gradually going insane from the stress of this situation, thought that the menacing truck matched my pace perfectly. At least he enjoys driving fast. And at that moment, my unnamed tormentor blew me away when their truck began to veer aggressively toward mine and started a deadly game of chicken between our rigs, that sinister red grin streak across their windshield, as if mocking me in the moonlight. So I steered closer to the cliff's edge, my truck screeching as I went. For a moment, I wondered if it would be futile to abandon the chase, but out of sheer willpower and determination, I pressed the pedal harder, and a few moments later, I saw my adversary fell behind me, sweating heavily. I stopped at the next rest stop to catch my breath as I paced. An elderly man approached me outside by the vending machines and asked if I was okay. His furrowed brow indicated that he was worried that someone else had seen me. I answered in a trembling voice, telling him about my recent near-death experience. A look of horror flashed across his eyes as he muttered, "I've heard of that truck. A lunatic drives it takes." The old man simply shook his head and left when I asked if anyone knew who this driver was or why they did what they did. His silence didn't help ease my anxiety, but even though I was uncomfortable, I couldn't rely on the word of another person any longer. So I got back into my rig with the sole intention of returning home safely to be with my family. This time, I muttered under my breath as the terrifying game of cat and mouse resumed. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of the situation, but I couldn't bring myself to call for help because I was afraid that the dreaded truck would suddenly reappear behind me like a terrifying spectre in my rearview mirror. Movements might incite my relentless pursuer, so I chose to outrun him and reveal who he was. I kept driving in an attempt to locate the closest police station, all the while watching the evil smile that followed me around every corner. The truck stayed stuck to me as though our fates were connected, and I couldn't imagine the sick joy this person got from frightening an innocent truck driver. Furthermore, what could they possibly want from me? My salvation arrived in the form of a woman with a broken-down car by the side of the road who flagged me down. I pulled over, grateful for any opportunity to get away from the ominous truck behind me, even if only briefly. As I got out of my truck and went up to her, I saw that she was holding something behind her. Reflexively, I stumbled back just in time to avoid her vicious attack, but it was too late. The woman swung around and revealed a large knife slashing at me in wires. The next few moments unfolded like an insane circus act as she repeatedly lunged at me with the knife while yelling profanities. Nevertheless, I was able to extract as fate would have it. An approaching police patrol was responding to an unrelated incident that occurred during our altercation and stepping in before it escalated further. With guns drawn and focused on the vicious woman, they demanded that she drop her weapon, which she shockingly complied with. I managed to escape this danger and return to my truck, while the evil truck driver watched silently from a distance in eerie stillness. I took advantage of the confusion and fled in my truck before the sinister driver was able to resume their pursuit. A few days later, as I was recovering at home, I received a call from an investigator providing me with an update on the situation. It turned out that the woman was a part of a larger network of individuals who terrorized innocent drivers on the road. "What about the truck driver?" I asked tensely, and the investigator said, "We can't locate him or his truck. It's like he vanished into thin air." Nevertheless, using the distinctive paint pattern on his windshield, we were able to identify him. His name is Marvin Wraith, and as I processed this revelation, my hands trembled. It now made sense why he was so evasive and cruel in his approach. His whole life revolved around causing unjustified suffering to other people, while knowing that he was still alive and unpunished made me uneasy. I was still in danger, and the weight of it all showed up as a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't go away. Months passed, and even though I never saw Marvin Wraith again, I continued to be on guard. The only thing I have left to cling to is hope that Marvin Wraith will be apprehended and brought to justice, so that my life can return to normal and I won't have to spend my days constantly watching over my shoulder out of fear that the eerie crimson grin will continue to haunt me, my family, and other innocent drivers who might fall victim to his evil schemes. Haunt me, but my determination never faltered. The question was, however, when would this unmatched game of cat and mouse end, or worse, would it ever end? My name is Colin Jonathan, and I drive a truck. As you may know, I've always appreciated comedians who can make ordinary situations into something funny. It was one of those boring days when I pulled into a rest area somewhere in Iowa for a much-needed break. The rest area seemed to be exactly what you'd expect, with people coming and going with their families and truckers stopping for a quick meal and a nap. It was hilarious just the other day when a bird pooped on my windshield, and I thought, why do they always aim for the driver's side? I wish birds had better manners. Nothing unusual happened, but on my way to the bathroom, I noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench who was extremely pale. He looked confused, almost as if he had experienced something traumatic or frightening. If it had been any other day or location, I might have stopped to see how he was doing, but I couldn't help but think of the man's haggard state. Tried to ignore it and carry on with my life. After cleaning up and getting a hot cup of coffee from the vending machine, I headed back to my truck, where I knew Troy, a fellow trucker, would meet me shortly. Once we got settled and started talking about our recent adventures, we heard a series of loud bangs in quick succession, followed by shouts and then complete silence. At what should have been a peaceful rest stop, we hopped back in our trucks without saying a word, because the person sitting across from us at another table was someone we had never seen before and who sent shivers down our spines. They were dressed in tattered clothes that hung off their ill-proportioned frame like rags, and their sunken eyes peered menacingly from beneath matted hair. We were driving down the highway when we noticed flashing lights from an ambulance up ahead. As we approached, I could see more clearly the gory scene that the ambulance was responding to. The older man from the rest stop was lying on the ground next to several people, some of whom had terrible injuries. It was obvious that something horrible had happened, and I couldn't help but think of that disheveled stranger who, given everything that had happened between then and now, had stared us down with unsettling intensity. Their presence during our brief encounter seemed even more sinister when we found ourselves at another rest area. Troy and I later recapped the terrifying events of the day, and we couldn't get rid of the feeling that an invisible force was somehow keeping an eye on us from a distance. This feeling only grew stronger when we realized that even though it sounded eerie, there was no way to prove any of our suspicions. Other people who shared our pastime appeared to be going through similar experiences. Perhaps I was too, scared or too naive to call for help. Whatever the case, my instincts told me that it wasn't the work of some random person with a rare capacity for violence. We both agreed to continue and just be more vigilant, making sure we never spent too long lingering at any stops along our routes. A week later, I had all but forgotten about those odd occurrences when I found myself passing through Iowa again. We did this without coming off as overly active or paranoid truck drivers spinning yarns over cups of coffee late at night, stories not meant for daylight conversations. When I pulled into the parking lot, it was a scene eerily reminiscent of that fateful day. I heard Troy's voice, my constant source of support, and turned to see him pulling right beside me. This was not my choice, rather, it was an assignment from up high that deterred me to the original rest stop out of pure interest or perhaps morbid curiosity. Though we knew that calling for help would be the prudent course of action, Troy and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as we entered the rest area. We saw smeared bloodstains on the floor and walls, hinting at the terrible acts that must have occurred since our last visit. We faced whatever lay ahead with unmatched courage shared from one trembling hand to another. We felt compelled to investigate who or what was responsible for this horrific scene. We walked tiredly through the empty building, carefully inspecting. We looked in every area for indications of danger, and in one corner we found a lady savagely. Her horrified eyes begged us, while she was attacked and fighting to stay conscious. Troy and I collaborated to save her, moving with unwavering resolve to assist her while watching for the enigmatic person we had met. Earlier, we hastily bandaged her in a temporary way and advised her to look for the woman. Nodded feebly and said, "I need to get medical help as soon as possible," expressed her gratitude in a whisper before managing to divulge some important details about the assailant who was watching us. According to her, the man was tall, incredibly slender, and had an unusual strength. She also mentioned that his name was Raylan Burke, which conjured up as we proceeded through the blood. Neither of us had any prior recognition. Flooded corridors of the restroom, we came across even other horrifying moments. It appeared as though Raylan had assaulted without showing sympathy or regret only a few feet away from where people were naively going about their daily lives. In spite of his terrifying deeds, we were forced to learn more information on this man, his reasons, his background, or anything that could be useful to us comprehend the reason behind his frantic destruction tracking journey. We made friends with a local truck stop that is frequented by truckers in the area. Hank, an old-timer, told us crazy stories about a factory worker without a job named Ryan Burke, who became desperate and indebted and resorted to stealing in order to support his family. But after years of living on the brink, he finally discovered that he was irrevocably transformed. It seemed like he became a vicious and heartless killer as a result of his despair. Motivation appeared to stem from a strong dislike of people in positions of authority and those who decide to play the roles of truckers and law enforcement. In his twisted viewpoints remained unchanged as we gained additional knowledge about Raylan and his reasons. Troy and had grown ever more committed to ending his reign of terror despite the risk, but we were wise enough not to confront him directly. Instead, considering his unique skill set and crazy disposition, we chose to keep looking for him until, ideally, we could launch a coordinated attack with the help of local police enforcement, taking him by surprise before he could respond. And in the interim, we decided to educate our fellow truck drivers about the risks they faced when traveling on the open road. One gloomy night, after the police arrived at the scene of another horrific tragedy at a truck stop scene, we kept our distance and watched their inquiry from a distance. We felt obliged to alert them as the tension in the air became intolerably high regarding Ron's heightened sensitivity and violent tendencies. But just as we were discussing, he came out from behind a nearby object to make contact with the cops. Building with spine-tingling cries that are uncannily quiet and unaffected by our presence, we were unable to do anything but observe as the sounds of carnage reverberated in our ears and were vividly etched in our memories. The encounter left us in terror as he disappeared into the darkness. Considering whether to pursue this heinous murderer further, or if any effort would unavoidably result in their continued demise and devastation at Raylan Burke's hands, remained unanswered as fear pervaded the atmosphere, making us question whether we would soon encounter our own awful destiny along the increasingly gloomy route ahead.